I'm joined on the line by Tim Cohen, the author of The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
First of all, can you just say something about your Antichrist and a Cup of Tea book, which you're so well known for, and why it is that you think that the British royal family are actually going to be involved in the end of the world?
So you asked me about The Antichrist and a Cup of Tea. That is the first and actual book in history to give hard evidence on the identity of the Antichrist, biblical hard evidence. And it happens to be your king, King Charles III.
Yeah, but you said, didn't you, that he was never going to become king?
No, I'm surprised he became king. It wasn't necessary for him to fulfill the role. But he actually has more power and more access to wealth and so forth as king. So it doesn't harm the argument. If anything, it helps it, but I didn't feel it was necessary.
What about the current situation after October the 7th? Can you give us your take on what's been going on over in Gaza? Pretty horrific. We're now up around 45,000 civilian casualties amongst the Palestinians, far less amongst the Israelis, who are extremely well equipped and actually massively supported by Britain, the United States, and the countries and blocs like the European Union.
Yeah, I'd like to say a few things. In fact, I'm going to read something that I sent to you by email previously.
Well, I'd rather you just spoke rather than read something out, please, Tim.
I'm going to do both, because it's important to make these points that you and I and our other hosts can dialogue specifically on these things. But the first thing I'll say is 45,000 is a false figure. Hamas, the provider of those statistics, continually lies. The statistics have been mathematically shown by professors to be false, to be fraudulent.
By which professors? By which professors?
Hang on. People can just look that up online. It's quite easy to find.
I'd like to know from you. If you've done the research, you would surely know who these professors are who say that 45,000 people haven't died.
Hang on, Tony. I'll say this. You even had the United Nations putting out the false numbers from Hamas, which is what you've just cited. And Hamas is actually closer to 35,000 rather than 45 right now. But that being said, the UN itself in the past couple of weeks came out and cut the figure in half for women and children whom they were claiming had died in the war. And Hamas does not distinguish between its, terrorist militants and civilians. And in fact, many of the terrorists who've died are teenagers. They're younger than 20, and they're calling those civilian deaths. So the reality is the number of women and children who died in Gaza is actually very small relative to the percentage of the population. And secondly,
do you want to say what you think the percentage of civilians is, Tim? So I don't want you just reading something out. We've got to have a discussion. There's no point in you coming on here if you're just going to read something out without having any questions.
The majority who have died are Hamas terrorists. More than 15,000 of those who've died are Hamas terrorists. And as far as the number of civilians who've died, Israel has done a stellar job to keep that percentage low compared to any NATO nation, including the United States when it was dealing with Iraq, and Saddam Hussein and so forth. Israel has a fantastic track record in reality for minimizing civilian deaths, and civilian deaths cannot be avoided in a wartime situation.
Well, it's not a war, though, Tim, is it? Because it's very one-sided. The Israelis have an air force. They have United States bombs that they're dropping. Actually, those sorts of bombs that are designed. Can you listen for a second, please? We're having a discussion here. It's not just you reading out some statement. The bombs being dropped in Gaza are actually designed to destroy hard military targets. They're being dropped on civilians, and actually the Gazans, so far as I know, don't even have an air force.
It's a good thing they don't. And in fact, Hamas hides among the civilians and builds their facilities beneath civilian buildings, including schools, hospitals, UNRWA facilities. Israel is taking out those things that are underground, and that's the reason for the need for those bombs. They are, in fact, taking out what are equivalent to hardened facilities because many of them are beneath these structures that Israel is striking.
So why is it that the Israeli Defense Forces have flattened all these civilian areas? Or is it just that there are no real civilians in Gaza and that you have just simply got to kill everybody in order to kill the terrorists?
To flee. Israel is not attacking civilians. They've been warned to flee beforehand.
Yeah, and the big problem this week is that they've been warned to flee to Rafah, which is the last place for them to get to in the very south of Gaza, and now that's being attacked too, which is why the International Criminal Court, Tim, we're going to have a discussion, really. The International Criminal Court this week is issuing arrest warrants for Netanyahu
it's a false equivalence.
Over this concept of telling the civilian population to go to Rafah and then attacking Rafah. So what have you got to say to that?
What I have to say is in the last couple of weeks, Israel has evacuated almost 1 million people from Rafah, faster than the West thought possible. That's already occurred. And Israel is already warning the rest to flee. Rafah has fewer than 2 million, quote-unquote, Palestinians in it. More than half of Rafah has already evacuated in the past couple of weeks under Israeli direction to safe spots. So for you to sit there and say that Israel is attacking civilians in Rafah or this kind of thing is an absolute lie. And it's for you to buy the propaganda. It's not
Israel me that's saying that. This is the International Criminal Court, Tim.
The ICC is lying at the behest of South Africa and other nations that are working on behalf of Hamas terrorists, Qatar, etc., the aiders and abettors, in other words, of Hamas.
What about Benjamin Netanyahu himself, who this arrest warrant is for this week? He himself has faced enormous criticism from within Israel, hasn't he, from his own population, particularly about the treatment of the hostages. He's saying we want all the hostages back, but he's not negotiating for the hostages to come back. He's simply carrying on bombing Gaza and therefore slowly killing those hostages.
No, he's not. In fact, Hamas is seeking to kill the hostages anyway. Most of them are probably already dead. Hamas has been intentionally starving the hostages to death, not providing medical care to them, etc., the opposite of Israel's treatment of the so-called Palestinians, because Israel has not only been allowing the international community to bring massive amounts of aid into Gaza, people are not starving in Gaza. You have more people starving to death in the United States from malnutrition right now than you do in Gaza. The whole of Gaza.
Well, they did actually say a similar thing. Some people did about the Nazis, that the concentration camps in Nazi Germany were not starving in there, that they were like holiday camps, Tim. Many people have made this comparison between the wall around Gaza and the concentration camps of Nazi Germany. So how are these people supposed to get out of that area as it's being bombed? How are the people supposed to leave?
They already have, and they are being evacuated to areas that are not being bombed. For you to allege that the whole of Gaza is being bombed is to show stupendous ignorance of what's actually happening there. And in fact, Israel is being very targeted, moving from area to area to take out the underground Hamas tunnels, the underground supply tunnels. There are over 50 of them coming out of Egypt into the Rafah area. That's already known. Out of over 700 tunnels already identified in Rafah alone that Israel is attacking. So Israel is going after the underground Hamas terrorists, those that are hiding in buildings, those who are not fleeing with the civilians, though some are fleeing with the civilians as well. And that is what Israel is targeting. Israel's not targeting civilians. They never have. And in fact, the percentage of civilians dying in Gaza under Israel's bombardment is tiny compared to what has happened under the United States, even the United Kingdom, in past wars.
What
Israel
about?
Is doing
just going to
job.
Martin Summers come in here, my co-host here, Irish Republican Labour activist we call him, but Martin is a member of the Labour Party here in the UK. Martin, what do you make of what Tim's analysis there? He's effectively saying that the Israelis and the Israeli Defence Force have done everything they possibly can to minimise any kind of civilian casualties, but actually that the shall we say 40,000, Tim is saying 35,000, the United Nations is saying 45,000 civilian deaths, is actually that they're doing the absolute best they can to minimise those casualties.
Tommy,
do you want to correct my figures there?
UN information. That's not what the UN is saying. The UN changed its tune in the past couple of weeks and cut their figures in half for women and children, and they're still blowing hot air.
Yeah, well, I think what happens is the first casualty of war is the truth. Anyway, Martin, what do you make of this assertion Tim's making here that the Israeli Defence Forces are doing everything they can to minimise civilian casualties?
Well, let's start off with why we can agree. The British and US way of war in Iraq was just as barbaric. The Israelis, in a sense, are doing nothing that this country hasn't done and that the US hasn't done in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq. The Israelis are part of the Western team. And in a sense, you'd be quite right to say, why single us out when you're just as bad? I totally agree with that. I'm
not saying just as bad, Martin. I'm not saying that. I'm saying what Israel is doing is far superior to what the United Kingdom or the United States or other NATO countries, or for that matter, any military in the world has ever done in the history of warfare. The Israel today is doing all kinds of things that the United States, other NATO nations, never even tried to do to protect civilians, ever, in the history of warfare.
So can you just give us an example, Tim?
Oh, sure. Supplying the civilian population in the middle of war. That's a simple one right there.
Right. Okay, well, I mean...
Knowing that the terrorists, the combatants who want to destroy Israel, are right there in the middle of that population.
I mean, it's a bit of a bit cheeky to talk about the terrorists destroying Israel, Tim, isn't it? Because Israel seems to want to destroy the Palestinians too.
Against Israel.
Tim, can you just answer that point? Tim, could you please just answer the point? You're talking about the Palestinians wanting to destroy the state of Israel, but I mean, by the look of things, Israel is trying to wipe Gaza off the map too.
That's false. If that's what Israel was trying to do, they'd be militarily occupying the whole of Gaza, which they're not doing. In fact, they withdrew battalions before they went into Rafah. And they're not trying to take total control of Gaza. They want to ensure that Gaza can't rearm later to again threaten Israel. But they're not planning to have a military occupation of Gaza. Israel's been clear about that, and Israel has already been allowing Gazan civilians to return to the areas from which they were evacuated previously, except where there's combat operations occurring. And in due course, Israel is seeking to have a multinational group of nations, including Muslim nations particularly, come in to basically govern Gaza, while Israel retains military control of the borders to ensure that Gaza cannot rearm against Israel. And meanwhile, Hamas has said they want to have, 1,000 October 7th and then some against Israel. They want to annihilate Israel off the map. And meanwhile, poll after poll shows that 4 out of 5, if not actually 9 out of 10, Gazans support Hamas and what they did to Israel and would vote for Hamas to be in power if it were their choice following this situation with Gaza right now. These are enemies of Israel and they want to annihilate Israel. They are the actual genocidal maniacs, not Israel.
So don't you think it would make sense, Tim, don't you think it would make sense for the United Nations to send a force in? We've now got this week, we've had also Spain, Ireland and Norway adding their names to the list of countries that recognise Palestine as an independent state. So this does rather suggest that the one-state solution is a total failure and that there needs to be 2 separate states there. And to get the Israeli Defence Forces out and to have some sort of UN force in order to make sure that the Palestinians do have their rights as a nation and are kept away from the Israelis.
All right, there are multiple points to be made around this. The first is that historically God promised all that land to Israel, and not just where the so-called Palestinians are today, but most of the surrounding nations around Israel today are part of Israel's biblical promised land. Now, biblically, Israel has been in rebellion against God by not embracing Christ Jesus, Messiah Yeshua, all this time, who's the real God of Israel incarnate, the real Messiah.
But isn't that so? That is a quid pro quo, surely. If God is giving land, hang on. God is giving the Jews the land, but only if they obey His commandments. Surely, Tim, please just answer that one. The land is theirs so long as they behave themselves, basically.
That's right. And Israel is going to come to faith at Yeshua's return some years from now, the surviving third of Israel. So between now and when Yeshua returns a few years from now, 2/3 of Israel in Judaea, which is where most of modern Israel's population, the Jewish population, resides, 2/3 will die. That means millions of Israelites are about to die. That means that what Hamas has plotted against Israel to do 1,000 October 7th, it's actually going to be closer to 2,000 or more October 7th that happen in the next few years against Israel from all the surrounding enemies of Israel. So Israel's about to suffer some very horrible things. Now, when we talk about a so-called two-state solution, that is antithetical to Scripture. It's antithetical to God's plan for humanity and for Israel. And in fact, what Scripture actually says is going to occur, if people want to look this up, it's Psalm chapter 83. In Psalm 83, verses 1 to 8, and also Zephaniah chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, it talks about the plotting of the nations against Israel, the surrounding adversaries. It identifies those nations in the psalm, and their intention to cut Israel off from being a people. In other words, to genocidally wipe Israel out. We are seeing the fulfillment of that right now. That is what's coming to pass currently and in the coming years before Armageddon. And the consequence of all of this, with the world trying to impose a so-called Palestinian state upon Israel, trying to impose division of Jerusalem, and Scripture is clear that Israel is going to be successfully attacked. The whole city of Jerusalem is going to be encircled by Israel's adversaries. Half the city, specifically, is going to be taken captive and forced by war. We can see that in Zechariah chapters 12 to 14. And the end result of that will be that Israel, at the end of what's called the Great Tribulation, the final 3.5 years preceding Yeshua's return in Armageddon, Jesus' return in Armageddon, the end result will be that the Lord turns the surviving third of Israel Christian in one day. The entire surviving third will become Christian in a single day. And the moment, Tony, that happens, the Lord will turn his attention toward the nations, and he will annihilate Israel's adversaries globally.
Well, that may or may not be the case, but
well,
I mean, a lot of what you're quoting there. Just a minute, can you just hang on? Hang on,
Give
Tim.
me 1 minute to finish.
A lot of what you're quoting there is Old Testament. Surely this isn't really a Christian analysis, is it? This is an Old Testament analysis you're giving. It's not a New Testament analysis.
It makes no difference. It's an Old Testament prophecy. It's not yet fulfilled, and it's about to be fulfilled. And
okay,
in
so
fact,
can you tell us where you think we are now? I mean, it's one thing we can definitely agree on is this concept of, a lot of people talking about Armageddon, the end of the world, this sort of thing. I mean, it certainly looks to many around the world as if Israel is a nuclear-armed doomsday cult of some sort. Whether it's just the fact that this is a particular bunch of people who are in charge in Israel. But where do you think we are in this end of the world scenario?
Listen, Israel's Knesset is filled with religious Jews, besides secular ones. They know these prophecies. They know that the whole promised land is to go to Israel at some point, and they are not trying to wipe out their adversaries. They're merely trying to defend themselves. It's the Messiah himself who, when Israel turns to faith, is going to then fulfill his promises to the nation as a new Christian nation when the time comes.
But don't you think that actually what the Israeli government, the way it is right now with Netanyahu, Benny Gantz and the rest of them, they're actually discrediting the faith more than anything else. What they're doing is they're sending out a message to the world that you must be mad to believe any of this biblical stuff because you're creating wars because of your twisted beliefs in God.
No. If they were trying to actually follow God and obey God, they wouldn't cede any territory in any agreement ever. And they would have, in 1967, Israel, when they had the opportunity, again, 1973, they would have taken a good portion of Egypt, all of Syria, all of Lebanon, all of Jordan. They could have done that, and they didn't. They chose not to. And in fact, they chose peace with their adversaries who still sought their destruction. But let me say this. God's not going to wipe out all of the Muslims surrounding Israel following Armageddon. Many of them who survive Armageddon and the judgments that ensue following it, after Israel becomes a new Christian nation, will themselves become Christians. And those who sought Israel's destruction but have become Christian at that point, whom the Lord has allowed to live, will be Israel's servants in the expanded promised land, the newly given promised land to Israel, until their natural deaths. And the children who are born to those servants of Israel will be like free individuals in the land of Israel, just like native Israelites
themselves. It almost sounds to me like you're talking here about Israel becoming a kind of world capital in the future at some point.
That is going to happen from Jerusalem under Yeshua. He is going to rule the world from Jerusalem, per the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments. But this being said, the world is trying to foist a Palestinian baby. Let's call that the baby of the United Nations and the rest of the nations of the world, trying to foist a Palestinian baby in the midst of the Promised Land versus God's baby, which we'll call Israel. So Jerusalem is where God's baby is centered, if you want to put it that way. And the world is now trying to foist a Palestinian baby on Israel. Let's consider for a moment the story of the two women who each had a son in the Old Testament. One lady rolled over on her baby in the night and suffocated it to death, ostensibly, but the baby died. So she stole the other woman's child, claimed that child for herself.
Yeah, this is also in Bertolt Brecht's Caucasian Chalk Circle, isn't it?
Yep, they both came before Solomon. And Solomon, hearing both women claiming that the child was their own, decided to solve the issue by cutting the baby in two and giving half of the baby to each woman. The real mother of the child said, "No, don't kill my son," and was willing to give her son up to the other woman so that the child would not be killed. Solomon then knew who the actual mother was and gave the child to the real mother rather than the lying woman who killed her own child in the midst of the night. This is what we see today with the world trying to foist a malevolent, vicious, violent, quote-unquote, Palestinian baby on Israel in the midst of the land that God deeded to the nation of Israel. And when under the United Nations, under the Antichrist himself and under the United Nations, Israel is successfully attacked and half of Jerusalem taken captive in war, under the Antichrist, he actually will cut the baby in two, the surviving baby, which is Jerusalem, because Gaza is going to die due to the malevolence of Israel's adversaries.
Well, look,
Israel's
I mean, a lot of what you're saying is you're reading it out, which is a little bit irritating. But anyway,
no,
Tim,
I'm not reading anything.
Tim, can you just listen for a second, because I'd like to ask you about Zionism generally. I mean, what you're painting a picture there is of the Zionists actually doing God's work. Some people have said actually that they're more akin to the Nazis, and they had a lot in common with the Nazis. This idea of the master race, it's nothing to do with love. It's actually all about we are far superior to you.
So I'll say three things about that. There are two kinds of Zionists. There are the Edomite Jews, which are people who descend historically from Edomites who converted to Judaism, like Herod, Antipas in the New Testament. And then there are the actual Israelite Jews. The Edomite Jews have always sought to rule the world, including from Israel, by taking over the promises that God deeded to the nation of Israel. And I could say a whole lot about Edomites, and will, in upcoming books, in fact. But the Zionists, who are the more malevolent ones, and there are some malevolent Zionists, are actually the Edomite Jews. And I'm talking about people like the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, people who actually do not believe.
Yeah, but the Rockefellers, hang on, the Rockefellers are Baptists. The Rockefellers are Baptists.
Not all
Jews?
Of them. No. Some are Jews. At any rate, the point I'm getting at is that there are malevolent and non-malevolent people out there. And you actually have some rabbis in Israel today, a small number, who think that the world should be worshiping Israel. You know, who have this attitude, well, you worship, speaking to Christians, for example, you worship one Jew, you should actually be worshiping all of us because we die for your sins, the nation's sins, in other words, every day. Those are false, satanic viewpoints, just as anti-Christianism is satanic, under the devil. But this being said, it doesn't change the fact that God has made certain promises to the nation of Israel when Israel is faithful to him. It doesn't change the fact that the whole promised land, which Israel in all its history has never had, which is bounded by the Euphrates River, the seas, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, what you're saying here is very much, the ideas from the Old Testament and from the book of Samuel, from the book of Kings. the idea that this is actually the way the world works today, many people around the world, rightly or wrongly, I would say rightly, will be questioning that. But this connection between Zionists and Nazis cannot just be sort of brushed off. And
yes,
I was noticed recently that someone put out an interesting series of quotes where Nazis were writing about Zionism. So let's have a listen to that now.
Did you know that the Nazis were enthusiastic Zionists and were deeply dedicated to creating a Jewish state in Palestine? Reinhard Heydrich said, "The time cannot be far distant when Palestine will again be able to accept its sons, who have been lost to it for over 1,000 years. Our good wishes, together with our official goodwill, go with them." Adolf Eichmann declared, "I am a Zionist too. I want every Jew to leave for Palestine." Dr. Hans Frank proclaimed, "I think that the tragedy of the Jewish people, if we wish to speak of it, could be solved legally by tackling the question of the establishment of the Jewish empire in Palestine with all our might." Alfred Rosenberg insisted, "Zionism must be actively supported in order to transport a certain number of German Jews to Palestine, or generally across the border every year." Julius Streicher affirmed, "I believe that another international solution would still be found, and that someday discussions would take place between the various states with regard to the demands made by Zionism. These demands aimed at a Jewish state." The Nazi Zionist Song of the National Socialists was a rallying cry to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine for the Jews. Toss out the whole gang of Jews. Toss them out of our fatherland. Send them back to Jerusalem, then they will be among themselves again with their tribe Shem. Toss out the entire Jewish bunch. Toss them out with their crooked noses. The Zionist objective of the Nazi-era board game, Juden raus, Jews get out, is to round up Jews in sixes and send them off to Palestine. The Nazis fulfilled Zionist Theodor Herzl's scheme to transfer Jews under duress from Europe to Palestine in what was called the Transfer Agreement. Well over 60,000 German Jews were coerced into moving to Palestine. They built the new nation of Israel, all according to Herzl's plan.
So I'll put a link up to that. In fact, I'll post that video up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk later. And actually, the references to those quotes, whereabouts they were, the books obviously are not in there. So, but they are actually up on the video. So I'll post that up on our show page later at thisweek.org.uk. What do you got to say to that, Tim?
Yeah, those are mostly lies, those quotes. And in fact, the Nazis, even before World War II, were working with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, called the so-called Grand Mufti, but he was virulently anti-Israel and wanted to annihilate the Israelites, and in fact was stirring up a lot of that hatred that we see today in the surrounding Muslim nations, and particularly among those who became the so-called Palestinians. And in fact, Yasser Arafat was related to this al-Husseini character, but he was basically an Arab Nazi, and his intention was to annihilate all the Israelites and Jews in the Middle East. And Hitler was working with him, and in fact, you had plenty of Arabs who joined the Nazis in World War II because they knew the Nazis wanted to wipe Israel out, and they wanted to support the Nazis.
Well, also, they didn't trust the British, did they? They were fighting the British.
What you just played was a whole lot of nonsense and lies.
Well, okay, so people can check that up when I put. People can check the quotes
it's
up.
The complete opposite of the truth.
Okay, so people can check the quotes later when I pop that up on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. But I think it's only fair to let Martin come in and say what he makes of this whole idea of the end of the world, that things are getting crazy, Armageddon, and actually the religious aspect, because for many people, they see the religious people, rather than actually trying to spread love as Christ, Moses, the rest of them wanted to do, to spread the Ten Commandments in order to basically have laws and order in society, as well as, of course, Muhammad. They see these religious people, Martin, as maniacs who are actually going to start a world war if they're not careful.
Well, it's difficult to have a dialogue when we've got so little in common in our way of looking at the world. I mean, I'm listening to what you're saying, Tim, and we just don't see the world in the same kind of way.
I see it correctly, Martin.
Okay, well, obviously you believe
Tim,
that.
Tim, just let Martin finish, please.
Obviously you do believe that. You seem a genuine person to me. You genuinely believe
Martin,
this stuff.
can you just tell me what you make of this religious aspect, which should be for good, but it seems to be turning the other way? Well, I mean,
the traditional Enlightenment view would be that religious ideas are basically infantile, and as we grow, I'm not saying I agree with this. I'm just saying this would be the traditional secularist view of religious ideas in general, that they are, part of humanity's childhood, and that as we grow up and become more sophisticated, people won't believe these kind of things anymore. I don't think that's actually true. I think people haven't changed that much, and that, people are going to believe what they want to believe. And that includes you and me. When we all believe we're right, otherwise we wouldn't believe what we believed, would we? I've got a bit of what you might call a more secular political military aspect to all of this, is that I cannot see how Israel can win from the position they've now got themselves into. The state was created by the British at the end of 1917.
Tim, let Martin
I'll be brief. The state was created by the British with the Balfour Declaration. That they created the possibility of that state, and then the War of Independence in 1948, in which lots of British soldiers and police officers were killed by Zionist terrorists. They killed our police officers and soldiers. We fought them already. We've been to war with Israel in this country. They were our enemies. And that's how it was. They killed lots of our people, and lots of people in this country were quite angry about it, because it was the British who actually, I'm just saying that there's going to be different views.
Tim, you're going to have to just be quiet, please, and listen to what Martin has to say.
I'll be very brief. I think politically and militarily, this has been a disaster for Israel. Don't forget, you've got the Russian military in Syria, and the war in Syria was fomented by the Western powers to try and overthrow Assad. The Egyptians, who are under a pro-Western military dictatorship, are lining up with Turkey and South Africa on this international criminal, the ICJ condemnation of genocide. Don't forget, the Egyptians have got the biggest army in the Middle East, and if they go to war with Israel, Israel's about the size of Wales.
I've just heard this week as well that the Turks have brought in new laws that the Turkish government, Tim, is now starting to pass laws to make sure that its mobilisation of its citizenry into the Turkish army will go smoothly. So they're preparing to mobilise Turkey for war.
Listen, it's not about the size of militaries. It's not about the capacity of militaries.
And this is all really down to Netanyahu and his friends.
It is entirely about God's will and his timing for things. In 1967, Israel should have been annihilated. 1948, Israel should have been annihilated. 1973, Israel should have been annihilated. But in what is coming, God is going to allow half of Jerusalem to be taken captive in war by force. He's going to allow the annihilation of about 2/3 of Israel in Judea. And at the end of that, when Israel comes to faith and is again faithful to God for the first time in thousands of years, I'm speaking of the nation as a whole. I'm an Israelite believer right now, so there are hundreds of thousands of us in the world who've already become Christians like me. I'm an Israelite, I'm a Levite, I'm a descendant of Aharon, Moses' brother, directly. I know my tribe, and I'm a Christian at the same time. All of Israel is going to become like me, the surviving third. And when that happens, God will then fulfill his promises to the nation that have not been fulfilled yet historically. Now, that being said, it is true that in the natural, Israel has no hope against this kind of military armada that's being formed against it.
Well, I think surely it's the Palestinians that have no hope against the Israeli Defense Forces.
Can I also make...
Well, I'm not speaking directly of them at the moment, but to address them just briefly, I said the Palestinian baby is going to die, and I meant it. In other words, they've killed themselves. They've had multiple opportunities to have that second state with Israel. Under Barak, under Ehud Olmert, etc. There were plenty of, I'll call them traitors in Israel who don't believe in God or his promises, who were willing to negotiate away the land and give the so-called Palestinians almost everything they wanted.
Well, yeah, Rabin was assassinated for his trouble, wasn't he?
Half of Jerusalem.
What have you got to say about that? Rabin was assassinated. He tried to do this.
And Abu Mazen turned them down. They rejected those offers, and now we are where we are.
So was it good to have Rabin assassinated, do you think, Tim?
He was assassinated, of course.
Was it good? Was that God's will?
Well, it happened, so yes, it was God's will.
And it's God's will that Hamas are basically standing the Israeli defense occupation forces a serious fight. It's a big, very serious fight on the measure of the Warsaw Ghetto. And as you say, that a third of the Israelites are going to be destroyed, then Hamas are carrying out God's will, aren't they?
They are.
They are. So they're on God's side. That's what they think.
Anyway, we don't have a tremendous amount of time, but what we're going to hear from now is a woman called Melanie Ward. She's the chief executive of something called Medical Aid for Palestinians, and they have been doing quite a lot of work in trying to get aid in, which has been extremely difficult for them to do. So Melanie Ward is the Chief Executive Officer of Medical Aid for Palestinians, and she's been talking this week about their efforts to get aid through the blockade into the people in Gaza.
We reported earlier about that new pier into the sea, which was going to be used to try and get more aid into people who are still trying to carve out a living in Gaza. Melanie Ward is the Chief Executive Officer of Medical Aid for Palestinians, one of the organisations working in this zone. Melania, welcome to our coverage. What updates do you have? Is enough aid getting through? Is any aid getting through just now?
Tiny amounts of aid have been getting into Gaza only for the last 2 weeks. 2 weeks ago today, the Israeli military took control of the Gaza side of the Rafah crossing, and that was the main place for aid to cross into Gaza. But it's important, obviously, we're in an absolutely desperate situation where for almost 8 months now, people in Gaza, civilians in Gaza, have been denied access to the most basic of supplies. The lack of food, the use of starvation as a weapon of war is the reason why we have famine conditions in large parts of Gaza. And ever since the Israelis took control of the Rafah crossing, no aid has been able to get in through that route. So ourselves as Medical Aid for Palestinians, we have 17 trucks of aid. That's medical supplies, shelter items like tents and so on, which are waiting to cross and which are unable to do so. It's also not just aid. The closure of the crossings means that medical evacuations of seriously injured children are unable to take place. And it means that aid workers like myself and the doctors who work with my organisation are unable to come into Gaza to support in the hospitals there. So the situation is absolutely desperate, and people are dying because of what's being done here.
And the stumbling block, I mean, there's probably several stumbling blocks, to be honest, is what? Is it Israeli officialdom at the border post?
It's very clear to the world that there have been deliberate efforts to stop adequate amounts of aid being allowed into Gaza. And that's been done through border crossing points. Land crossings have been closed. Or in the case of one of the other crossings that exists just now, there is heavy bombing and shelling on the other side of it. So even if the border crossing was open and we were able to get some trucks in, nobody can go there to collect it because there are Israeli airstrikes and shelling from tanks all around it. So there's a deliberate, closure and restriction of aid that's getting in through the land crossings. That's the main problem. We also have trouble though with trying to move items around inside of Gaza. Obviously, if you're going to move around trucks and trucks of medical supplies, food, water, other such items, you need fuel. Yeah. So fuel is not being allowed in an adequate amount either. And then across Gaza has been divided into two between the north and the south. And there are Israeli checkpoints right across there. And so even aid workers trying to move from the south of Gaza to the north, where the famine is worst, there are many instances of aid workers, including UN workers, being shot at when they try to cross that. So the whole thing comes together to make this the most difficult and dangerous place in the world to try to deliver aid. And with great fanfare, of course, the United States have put in place their new maritime corridor. That's what they call the floating pier. Yes. But only actually a tiny trickle of aid is able to get in.
Is that even working? Do you understand is that even working? Is anything coming by that route?
My understanding is that there have been a small number of trucks that have come in from that route, but they come from Cyprus. And it's a very convoluted way to try to get aid supplies in, when in fact, as I say, there are many land crossings between Israel and Gaza. And if the Israelis would just open the land crossings to aid, we could literally drive it in from a few miles away rather than having to bring it across the sea. And the other problem with the US floating pier is that it will not operate past September because the sea will become too rough then. So these things may provide tiny amounts of change, tiny amounts of supplies in the face of overwhelming, massive humanitarian need, but they're not proper solutions. I was in Gaza myself last month. I saw the situation for myself. It couldn't be more desperate. You have more than 2 million people without adequate access to water, to food, to shelter. People have had to leave their homes and they're sheltering under very flimsy pieces of plastic. There isn't adequate sanitation. People have nowhere to go to the toilet. So on every measure, the humanitarian disaster is absolutely enormous.
Melanie, tell us your experience then of how on earth did you get into the territory to see your colleagues, and how did your journey out? I mean, what route did you take?
So I crossed from Egypt, which is the route that most humanitarians and medical workers have been using for the last 8 months, through the Rafah crossing. And that's the crossing which the Israelis took control of 2 weeks ago and which we're no longer able to use. So
it's a dangerous route though, isn't it? Yeah. Did you have a sense of your own personal safety was under threat?
Of course, I'm very aware that Gaza is a very dangerous place to work. But we as Medical Aid for Palestinians have many Palestinian colleagues who live and work in Gaza. So obviously they are the ones who are at most risk. So for me, it was very important to go to see them, to see the situation in the hospitals for myself, where my organisation MAP is working, and to see the conditions on the ground for myself. And I can't express the extent to which the scale of the need is absolutely enormous. There are just displaced people everywhere who've had to flee their homes. There are lakes of raw sewage right next to the tents where they're living and where children are playing. There isn't enough water. I saw children sitting by the roadside with empty pans, empty plates, because they don't have enough to eat and are in famine conditions, as you know. I went to a hospital, Al-Aqsa Hospital in the middle area. One of the things you might be aware of is that only a tiny handful of Gaza's hospitals are still operating. And we had Medical Aid for Palestinians doctors supporting in that hospital, but I've never seen anything like it. The hospital was so overcrowded. I went into a children's ward, which was supposed to, the bay I went to was supposed to have 3 children in it. And instead it had 8. And every one of the children had severe injuries from Israeli airstrikes. I saw a little girl with a severe arm injury and abdominal injuries, and she was screaming in pain because there wasn't enough pain relief to give her. So it's a disaster on every level, and tiny trickles of aid are not the answer. We need full and unimpeded access for aid across all land crossings and for aid workers. And what we need most of all is an immediate and lasting ceasefire.
Melanie Ward, thank you very much indeed for spending a few minutes with us. Melanie's the Chief Executive Officer of Medical Aid for Palestinians.
Yeah, so MAP, we used to have a cup in the previous studio with Medical Aid for Palestinians on the side of it. Tim, I guess you'd say you don't want a ceasefire. You think this is God's will for the war to carry on. Or, I don't know. What do you think?
All right, well, I'll say a couple of things. First of all, if you're going to play some long thing like that, interrupted enough for me to respond to what's being said. But let's start with this. That was a Palestinian woman claiming to represent an objective viewpoint. Most of what she said were flat-out lies.
No, hang on. Sorry to interrupt you, but
Tony,
she's
Tim.
She's not Palestinian. She's Scottish. Tim, she's not Palestinian. Tim, she's not Palestinian. She's Tim.
Brothers and sisters.
Tim,
allow me to make my point.
She's not Palestinian. She's Scottish.
Allow me to make my point. What she said was false. There's more than 100 vehicles going in even now per day into Gaza. The firing at people trying to get aid in and so forth is primarily coming from Hamas terrorists themselves, who've already attacked the pier twice at least. Secondly, Israel has tried to reopen the Rafah crossing for aid coming from Egypt. It's the Egyptians themselves who have refused to reopen it. She didn't bother to mention that. Thirdly, there's another crossing, at least one or two others that Israel has already opened into Gaza that are operating right now, every day, normally. So it's completely false, the picture that she portrayed. Additionally, there are, like I said, more people starving here in the United States, percentage-wise, today than in Gaza today. They're not starving there. Yes, they are having problems with shelter and cold and all of that. That's true. But they are not starving there. And there's plenty of food there, in fact, at this point in time for the Palestinians in Gaza. All this being stated, I was trying to get to a point before you played all that about God's will in all of this situation, what Hamas is doing. So here's what I'm going to say. Christ was crucified at the middle of the crucifixion week. It was God's will that he be crucified and then rise from the dead at the end of that week. What Israel is suffering now and about to go through, where 2/3 of Israel in Judea dies, preceding Armageddon, is God's will. And it's because the nation has been unfaithful to him, and he's allowing the devil and his minions to have their way, if you will, with Israel to an extent. But once Israel repents and turns back to God, the surviving third, at that point, the Lord will turn his attention to the nations of the world who've treated Israel so very wickedly and falsely accused Israel like they're doing now at the ICC. You recall that Yeshua, Jesus, was tried before Pilate, and prior to that, before Caiaphas and Ananias, the hypocritical, priests of Israel at the time, and then before the Romans. Pilate represented the Romans. And then he was crucified. He was tried first. What we're seeing right now between the ICC and the ICJ, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, the latter one being more directly connected to the United Nations, is an effort to bring Israel before the world to try the nation. And Netanyahu, if you will, is representative of the nation of Israel. So the world is going to falsely accuse Israel, Netanyahu standing in this case, for Messiah in a very loose manner of speaking, and going to convict Israel and decide to crucify Israel, and that's what taking half Jerusalem captive
you have actually already made that point. There's a sort of battle for hearts and minds as well going on, which the Israelis have lost. So I put it to you that you're putting the position, which is actually a Gnostic position, Tim. Tim, you do have to listen as well. You've had a good say there. It's actually a Gnostic position where you're actually portraying the Israeli leadership, the greater Israel bloc, which is now running the country, as fulfilling God's will, where actually they're fulfilling the will of the devil. This is a Gnostic point of view you're putting forward, isn't it?
Fulfilling the will of the devil by doing these things toward Israel, yes, and God is going to allow it. Those who do these things toward Israel are cursed by God. Let me be clear. And all the nations of the world that are involved in doing these things toward Israel are going to be annihilated.
I don't understand why you think that Israel somehow represents God. For many people around the world, Tim, for many people around the world, that Israel is right now is representing the devil.
Tony, Israel, while it's not serving God faithfully, those who are trying to pursue God's promises, saying, for example, we should settle the land, God deeded it to Israel, etc., we shouldn't be negotiating away the land, this kind of thing, even though they're not in faith in Yeshua yet, it's those individuals who will come to faith down the road, the ones who survive, and form a newly Christian Israel around the time of Armageddon and following Armageddon. So far as the rest of the world is concerned, those who are pursuing the division of Israel's land, the formation of a so-called Palestinian state, which is satanic, and Islam is a satanic religion. Let me be clear about that. It's always been a satanic religion. It is not a religion of peace. Never has been. It's always been built on murder, rapes, thefts, destructions, and, of course, spiritual lies. That's all it has ever been. But that being said, those who are pursuing the devil's agenda through Islam and other false religions against Israel, and ultimately against Christians, so against Judeo-Christianity, because they'll come for Christians next. Many Christians are going to be martyred in the Great Tribulation. It isn't only Israel. that will suffer. But when these things are done, and Israel comes to faith, and God's purposes are accomplished
it
toward
doesn't
Israel,
seem to be going to happen anytime soon.
then
Tim,
it's only
just be
years away,
can you just
Tony,
wind up within the
suddenly.
next 20 seconds, please, in this particular point, because it's going on a bit too
Yes.
long.
Israel's going to come to faith. Most of the nations of the world are going to cease to exist. The nations that will remain are a smaller Egypt, a newly constituted Assyria, and a vastly enlarged nation of Israel in the Middle East. And all around them will be newly constituted nations that replace the nations that exist today.
Yeah, well, this certainly seems to be the mission of
destroyed.
the Israeli Greater Israel bloc. Can you finally just tell listeners whereabouts they can find you online and how to get hold of your various books?
Yes, prophecyhouse.com, and they'll find all these things and many more, including the actual identity of the Antichrist in my books. And the latter one is The Antichrist in a Cup of Tea. The new second edition has just begun to ship, so it's out. Gives hard evidence that King Charles III is the Antichrist of biblical prophecy.
Well, fascinating stuff anyway. Thank you ever so much for your time. Let's just make it clear that there is this Gnostic point of view which puts the devil in place of God when interpreting the monotheistic faiths. And Tim Cohen, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Tony.